In this module, we're going to take a look at vulnerability analysis. This is a way that we can assess a network or a host for any potential vulnerabilities that might allow for unauthorized access. We'll look at vulnerability assessment tools, and we'll discuss the vulnerability management lifecycle. We'll also look at the importance of creating vulnerability assessment reports for our findings. Vulnerability assessments are one of the main things we are performing as ethical hackers. All of the tools and techniques we're using against a target are made for discovering vulnerabilities. That includes vulnerabilities in passwords, systems, networks, hosts, and more. So in short, we're looking for any weakness that a bad actor could take advantage of. And we're also testing out the effectiveness of any existing security systems. Let's talk about a framework that we can use for these assessments. As a general guideline, we can use something called the Vulnerability Management Lifecycle. This is an ongoing process that helps us to both identify and correct any security weaknesses that we discover in a system or a network before they can be exploited. There are many solutions for implementing each phase, so this will be individualized based on the tools that you choose to use. But this is a general framework that we should use when performing vulnerability assessments. Phase 1 is creating a baseline. And when we say baseline, we mean that we want to take an inventory of exactly what we want to protect and determine which assets are most critical. Some systems or applications may not be critical to the business operations, while others may be very much so. We want to take inventory of what these critical assets are, whether that be software, data, or the systems themselves, and we want to understand how these work. Having a baseline list of what we want to protect allows us to understand where we need to focus our efforts. Phase 2 is the vulnerability scan. We've looked at many tactics for this already, and in this phase, you'll use a large combination of tools to test out the baseline assets that you've already identified. This would include scanning the software, ports, and configurations needed for the operation of our critical components. We ideally want to make sure that we don't have verbose availability in a system or a network. For example, if we don't use FTP for any reason in our critical systems, it's an unnecessary risk to have an FTP service or port available. Vulnerability scans can help discover these types of things, as well as vulnerable software versions and infrastructure loopholes. Again, there are many methods for doing this, including the tools we've looked at previously, such as Metasploit, Nmap, and more. Phase 3 is risk assessment. This is where everything we discovered in the vulnerability scan is prioritized and assigned a level of impact. Each vulnerability that we found for our critical baseline assets can be categorized as either low, medium, or high risk. By ranking in this manner, we can determine which vulnerabilities are critical for resolving quickly. So this gives us a priority for our remediation steps. This is also the phase where we actually plan our remediation. We want to determine which changes can be made to patch up any vulnerabilities that we found before they can be exploited. Phase 4 is implementing our remediation plan. We perform steps that we deemed necessary in the previous risk assessment phase, whether that is software updates, firewall configuration rules, shutting down services and ports, and so on. We may also hand off remediation steps to other response teams, particularly if we are performing this assessment for a client, if we're a third-party penetration tester, for example. If we discover unnecessary ports or services running, we may recommend remediation steps to our client. And if they have an internal response team or internal network engineers, they may be responsible for this remediation. Phase 5 is verification. This is where we run our tools once again to ensure that the things that we found previously are no longer in place. We want to make sure everything has been patched and remediated as necessary. If the previous remediation is verified, that means we have applied all of the necessary fixes for the vulnerabilities discovered, and that our risk of exploitation has dramatically lowered. And finally, phase 6 is monitoring. We should encourage the organization or client to implement continuous monitoring, such as firewalls or IPS, in order to mitigate any emerging threats or vulnerabilities that may come in the future. We also want to monitor and ensure that none of the remediation steps that we've implemented are causing any unexpected issues with the critical assets, and that systems have the ability to continue to operate as needed and as expected. And as you can see, this is a continuous cycle. Periodically, we should continue to go through this life cycle as updates happen in the network, and especially as any new tools, software solutions, or hardware are introduced into the network. We want to ideally have a schedule for this life cycle to repeat itself in order to ensure the ongoing security of the systems in place. Let's jump briefly back into Parrot OS and let's take a look at how we can gather more information about any vulnerabilities that we discover. As we've already mentioned, there are many methods and tools for discovering vulnerabilities, and we do want to use everything at our disposal in order to be thorough. I'm going to start here with just an example tool called Nikto. This is a web server vulnerability scanner. So here in my Parrot OS terminal, I'm going to say Nikto-H, which indicates a host target. And let's use a machine I have in my lab that we've already looked at, the OWASP BWA virtual machine, and that is at 10.0.2.4. I'm going to hit enter and let this complete its scan. Now this isn't a demonstration of a particular tool, but here in this video, I want to talk about ways that we can gather more information about any vulnerabilities that we discover. And those vulnerabilities would be discovered using tools such as Nikto that we're demonstrating here. A large part of our job as ethical hackers is actually research. We need to understand not only how to gather relevant information from our targets, but we also need to understand how we interpret that and how we can research for vulnerabilities. There are so many possibilities out there that we can't simply go through lists of thousands of potential vulnerabilities. Now, there are lists of those thousands of vulnerabilities out there, but it's not a smart use of our time just to try and read through those. We need to know how to interpret our results, how to target our research, and how to increase our chances for success. Nikto is a great tool to narrow that down among other tools. So let's scroll up to the top of our results output and point out some things we can see. Of course, we see our target IP address, 10.0.2.4. If this web server had a host name, which this one does not, that would be listed here, but instead we have the IP address. We see that this is target port 80, which is of course HTTP service. And below that, we're going to have a list of all of our discoveries. We see that Apache 2.2.14 is running, so that's something good we might want to note. And further below that, we see some warnings. We see notes about certain items that are outdated. We're told that Apache 2.2.14 appears to be outdated and is end of life. We see information about some vulnerabilities related to brute forcing file names listed here, and all kinds of different things. If we take a look at an example of one of these that I'll point out, let's take a look at this one, mod SSL 2.2.14. Now we see lots of things here. We see that Python is outdated, OpenSSL is outdated, so everything here isn't necessarily going to be a vulnerability that we can exploit. I will point that out, but we can often find a gem in here. And although maybe they're not easily exploitable, we still do want to address these. Now we're going to see information about the types of vulnerabilities that this web server may be open to, such as the one I have highlighted here. We see that this states mod SSL 2.8.7 and lower are vulnerable to a remote buffer overflow, which may allow a remote shell execution. So in other words, we could potentially execute shell commands on this web server as another user from a remote computer. Now the section I want to point out here in this video, because we're looking at vulnerability information and how to gather that, is the resource that's linked here, cve.miter.org. This is the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure List, or the CVE list. And if we actually click that, it's going to open our web browser, and that's going to take us to the cve.miter.org website. This particular website is a collaborative effort from industry organizations and security researchers. These are lists of publicly disclosed security flaws, and you can see that this flaw is assigned a unique CVE ID. We see that listed here, 2002-0082. And below that, we see a description of the exact vulnerability that this is related to. Below that, we have references where there are different places we can see proof of how this works online and other sources if we want to do more research. So a really great tool here that Nick2 provides to us. It points us to a CVE entry for a particular vulnerability. CVE is a place we definitely want to use for vulnerability information gathering. Now, you'll also notice that we have a link to learn more at NVD, the National Vulnerability Database. And if we click that link, that will take us out to the NVD website. You'll notice this is an official website of the United States government, and that is supported by NIST. You've heard that word before. This website is found at nvd.nist.gov. And again, this is a public repository where people can disclose vulnerabilities. So again, we're going to see a specific CVE number that this was given. We're going to see the current description for that. And if we scroll down, we see also a severity rating. We see that this has a base score of 7.5 that is listed as high. So these severity ratings are going to be ranked from low to high, and it's going to give you an idea about how critical a particular vulnerability is if that's found on your system. And once again, if we scroll down further, we're going to have lists of hyperlinks that we have here, which are references to these findings. There are demonstrations about how these work, as well as suggested solutions and tools. Now, why is all of this important? Well, again, it goes back to our research. If we find a known vulnerability, just as we have here, and we see that it is well documented with the National Vulnerability Database, with CVE, then we already have proof of concept where researchers have exploited this. And that means that someone has already done the heavy lifting for us. I promise you that bad guys will keep an eye on these vulnerability databases as well. So when they discover a known vulnerability, that means there's an opportunity for them. Not only does it mean that you have this type of information, but you also don't have to work as hard for remediation steps. Oftentimes, these are suggested inside here. Now, those remediation steps may often be obvious. Maybe it's a simple patch or an operating system update, but other times maybe they're not. So this is a great resource for figuring that out. By the way, if we scroll back up to this CVSS score that we see here, the CVSS metrics, that was 7.5, we can actually go out to a website which is first.org. On this website, this is where we can see the CVSS scoring system and learn more about that. If we click on the calculator link in the left-hand menu, this is going to present a CVSS scoring calculator that we can actually interact with. So in the rare case that maybe you discover a vulnerability and you don't know what the score is for that, you don't know how critical that is, you could actually go in here and select some of the different parameters. For example, is the attack vector through the network? How complex is the attack? Are there privileges required? Is there user interaction required? In other words, can this vulnerability be exploited without any interaction from a user? What is the scope for this? And you'll notice that when I'm hovering over these buttons, we do get a description for that. You'll see our CAA triad here, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. How much are these affected? If we list these as high, you'll see that with all of these metrics in place, it gives us a score. This is scored as 9.8, which is critical. So just so that you understand a little bit about how the CVSS scoring works, feel free to go out and play with this calculator a bit and change some of these metrics so that you can understand how that scoring is given. One more place I'll point you to is cwe.miter.org. This is the Common Weakness Enumeration website. And of course, you can go through these links. You can look at the latest CWE lists. You can download those for yourself if you'd like and take a look around. Now, with all of these sources of vulnerability information, they do all have the availability to be searched. So you definitely want to keep these handy, even if you're not using a tool like Nick2, which may provide a direct link. You'll see that the CVE list, of course, has a search option listed up here. NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, we go back to the main menu for that, and we expand our vulnerabilities. Of course, we can search there as well as the CWE site. All of these have the ability to be searched. So the big takeaway here is know where you can get relevant and accurate information. Discovering vulnerabilities is only part of the battle. You then need to do some research, determine how bad this vulnerability is so that you can move forward through your vulnerability management lifecycle. We've looked at some examples of vulnerability assessment tools already in a few places throughout this course, and here I want to talk about that a bit more in regard to selecting tools as well as the different types of tools we should consider. We can generally classify our tools as active or passive tools. The main difference here is the impact on the devices we are scanning against. We want to use care when selecting which type of tool we're using, depending on the scope of our assessment. Active tools will consume resources on the devices and networks being tested. Passive tools do not affect resources and will simply gather data onto the machine from which they are testing and analyze that data. So if we're performing assessments during business hours, we want to be very careful with active scanning tools since they can negatively impact performance. In that case, we might want to use passive tools instead. Active tools are considered generally more thorough, but we want to use these types of tools during agreed upon times, maybe during non-business hours, so that the impact isn't as critical. We can also break these categories down further, so let's talk about host-based tools. As the name implies, this is primarily targeted towards host devices rather than networks. The functions of host-based tools would include the ability to discover which operating system is running on a device, as we've seen with some of our Parrot OS tools. Also, these tools have the ability to discover applications and services running on a host. This is helpful to scan against both end-user devices and especially against any servers in the network. In general, we're going to have more services and applications running on a server, which provides access to multiple hosts on the network and has large databases and directories in many cases. The main feature that a good host-based tool will offer is a suggestion for patches or fixes, in other words. We've seen this in action with some of our Parrot OS tools like Nikez, for example, where a particular vulnerability is discovered and a patch fix is suggested through a link to a CVE list entry. This saves us time in researching a particular patch. We also have application layer tools. Most typically, we use these against servers and databases rather than end-user devices. This is especially important when we're securing a public web server, which can be especially difficult to defend. Typically, web servers are vulnerable due to underlying vulnerabilities in the operating systems or even in the application being offered for service, so it's critical to examine these areas. With web servers and databases, we are looking for what we refer to as external vulnerabilities. This means that a vulnerability can be exploited externally from somewhere other than the local network. In other words, these vulnerabilities could be exploited by others through internet access to the web server. If we have external vulnerabilities, this means we're susceptible to things like DOS or DDoS attacks, which can disrupt services for our end users. A good application layer tool should support various operating systems and applications. There are numerous OS and applications used for web servers and databases, so we want a tool that is thorough and flexible. Next, we have depth tools. As the name implies, these are a more in-depth type of scan than the surface scanning we may perform. So rather than doing discovery, we're actively engaging in depth with a system or a network. This is an active scanner, so again, you want to use care with these types of tools. What we're looking for here are unknown vulnerabilities rather than scanning against a set of known vulnerabilities. So that's why the depth is required. Most commonly, we do this with fuzzing tools. Fuzzing tools, or fuzzers as they're often called, work by sending arbitrary data into a system or a user interface in order to observe the reaction. Can we maybe cause a buffer overflow situation through this arbitrary data that's being sent in, or maybe some other type of system instability? So essentially, we're seeing if our systems have any vulnerabilities that we aren't aware of from a well-known or already documented vulnerability standpoint. And finally, I'll mention location and data tools. These are used for network mapping and discovering any data that is shared throughout a network. We have a few categories here to mention. We have network-based scanners or agent-based scanners. Network-based scanners are going to scan a network from the perspective of whatever machine these tools are being executed from, and they're going to provide a network report that will help us map out the network. Agent-based scanners essentially do the same thing, but they also have the ability to scan from the perspective of other machines on the network as well. We can also break these down into proxy scanners or cluster scanners. Proxy scanners are network-based scanners that can scan against other networks besides the one they are attached to, so they can scan from any machine on the network. Cluster scanners are similar, but they can additionally perform simultaneous proxy scans from the perspective of multiple machines. As for some best practices when we're selecting and using vulnerability assessment tools, first, we want to ensure that we understand the function and effects of the tools being used. We need to be aware of any adverse effects these tools could have on the network or attached hosts and plan accordingly. As I already mentioned, this is a consideration when we're determining the scope of our scan and the timing of when that happens. We also want to make sure that we have logging enabled. When we're using these scanning tools, we should configure those to collect logs of everything that we do and everything that we discover, so that we can take action after we've gathered our information. And we want to make sure that we have a plan in place for frequent and ongoing assessments. Things change rapidly in every network as applications are updated and new services are introduced. So vulnerability assessments should not be a one-time action. This should be part of our regularly scheduled maintenance routine to make sure that we are always as prepared as possible. I'll wrap this up by mentioning a few tools for vulnerability assessments in addition to those that we've looked at in Parrot OS. There are numerous solutions out there, but I did want to point out some of the most popular options in the industry. Again, this is not a comprehensive look, but just a few examples for you to take a look at. The first one is Nick2. We've examined that in Parrot OS. That's a very popular tool. We also have a tool called Nessus. In particular, the professional version of Nessus is a very thorough vulnerability assessment tool. It has lots of different functions built inside of that, and you can go to tenable.com and check out a Nessus demo if you're interested in learning a little more about that. And the last one that I'll mention is a tool called Greenbone. The Greenbone Professional Edition comes in physical or virtual form, and it can discover vulnerabilities and classify those based on how severe they are. Once all of our assessments are performed, to wrap up everything, we want to create a report of our findings. Typically, this would involve meeting with any internal security or network team that a client has, or any other relevant party. This may also include management as well. We need to be able to communicate the information and findings that we've gathered, so good reporting is critical here. Let's go through some considerations for what we want to include in a good report. First, there are some things that we need to keep in mind during our assessment so that we have good information at the end. Throughout the course of our investigation, we want to be taking good notes. There's no right or wrong way to do that, and there are many tools that will serve you well. This is mostly a matter of personal preference, and I've seen tools ranging from Microsoft Word or OneNote for general note-taking, all the way to specialized tools like Cherry Tree, designed specifically for penetration testing. The important thing is to ensure that you are recording notes in some way, and I would definitely recommend a digital solution for this. It's going to be much easier to copy and paste your notes into a report format later if you use a digital means of note-taking, as opposed to having to transpose handwritten notes later. Also, during the process of assessment, it's good to take relevant screenshots or screen recordings as well, and to keep those with your notes. Again, this underscores the importance of using a digital means of note-taking. Now, you may or may not use all of these things in the report itself, but at the very least, they can be a great reference for later. And ideally, you do want to include some screenshots in that report to prove your findings. As for the reports themselves, let's talk about the relevant information you would want to make sure to include. You want to lay this out in a logical manner that is very easy to follow. So essentially, you're telling a story here. And right away, you want to begin with a general summary of your findings. This should ideally be the first item in your report. So if someone wants to get a 10,000-foot view of the issues in the network, maybe they're a non-technical team member like a manager, then they would be able to immediately understand what you found. In other words, you want to get straight to the point. This report will likely be very lengthy, so it's good to communicate the dangers and vulnerabilities to set a level of expectations and urgency right out of the gate. Next, you should include the attack narrative. This is where you go into detail about the actions that you took during the assessment. You want to break this down into the individual steps that you performed. So for example, you might first outline your scope and how much access that you were granted to the network, followed by the actions that you initially took. Maybe that's a host and operating system discovery scan. That may have progressed to finding a vulnerable, unpatched operating system, which you then use some other means to take advantage of. So you want to lay this out step by step with the actions that you took against the targets. This is where any notes, screenshots, or screen recordings you took will come into play. You can reference this information and include that in the report itself if you choose to. So in the attack narrative, you would want to identify how you performed certain actions and any targets of interest that you found. Following our logical pattern, you now want to have a detailed list of vulnerabilities that you've discovered. Each vulnerability should have its own report section. So for example, if you found a SQL injection vulnerability, and also a privilege escalation vulnerability, you want to give each of these their own section where you identify things like the date and the time of the discovery, the potential risk or impact of the discovery, the CVE score if that is applicable and available, and the details of the relevant system or systems which are affected. Again, screenshots or screen recordings are great here. Those can provide proof of concept for the vulnerability findings, and they can demonstrate how the vulnerability can be exploited. Next, you want to include recommendations for remediation steps. In other words, for each identified vulnerability, you want to have some good suggested steps for correcting that. This can include information about any services or ports that need to be shut down, any patches that need to be implemented, or any configuration changes that should be made, among other things. If you are performing assessments as a third-party investigator, it's likely that these steps will be handled by an internal team for the client, so you want to be detailed and thorough here. And finally, an optional but helpful section would be a report appendix. This is where you can include logging and reporting outputs from your tools themselves. For example, if you run a NIC2 scan and export those results, you could include the complete results into the appendix, in case an internal team is interested in the details from that perspective. Those outputs can be rather lengthy, so maybe you would choose to put those in an appendix rather than placing the full report in the detailed vulnerability section. Just to give you a visual idea of what one of these reports may look like, I would recommend you check out the Offensive Security website at offensive-security.com. You can see that address listed here on the screen. And from their website, you can actually find a sample penetration testing report, which is what we're looking at here. Again, there's no right or wrong way to organize or to format a report, but this is a very good example of that. It has an intuitive layout, including all of the relevant information that we've identified. You'll see that this document has a table of contents for each relevant section. And if we scroll down through that, you're going to find that they've included things like screenshots, you'll find NIST reference links, and all kinds of other helpful information that will allow you to effectively communicate what you've discovered. Your ability to perform assessment relies just as much on your penetration testing skill set as it does on the ability to record and communicate everything that you found. So don't overlook the importance of creating good reports. You can find other examples and templates for reporting online as well, so find something that seems intuitive and which works best for your reporting purposes. You'll likely have non-technical team members in your reporting meeting, so definitely keep that in mind as well when you are creating these reports.